Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Fanzasa. This is Battlefield 1. In today's video, we're covering the spread mechanics of this game, specifically looking at the 4 different spread models that operate in Battlefield 1. Before we do that, however, let's quickly get down some basics regarding spread in Battlefield 1. Well, what is spread? Well, essentially, it's the maximum amount of degrees the bullet can vary from your aim position. When you think about firing a bullet, you'd expect it to go in a straight line, with the exception, of course, of the force applied to it by gravity, which leads, of course, to bullet drop. Leaving bullet drop aside, however, the bullet doesn't actually usually travel in a perfect straight line in Battlefield 1 because of the spread that your weapon has. Spread is the maximum amount in degrees that this bullet can vary from the straight line position you would expect it to be traveling at. What this means is, and given that spread applies into all directions, both horizontal and vertical, is that you end up with a circle measured in degrees in which your bullet will randomly be placed depending on your spread. The higher, of course, the spread value, the more inaccurate the weapon because the larger the circle. However, a spread of, for example, 0.2 doesn't mean that all your bullets will land on an 0.2 degree deviation from the straight line. It means that the maximum distance or the maximum deviation in degrees they can have is 0.2. The game randomly but evenly places the bullets within up to 0.2 degrees variation. It can also mean that your shot actually fires at an 0.1 deviation to the right versus you may thinking that it would fire with an 0.2 deviation to the left. With that being said, 2 other things to quickly note about spread in Battlefield 1 is, of course, that it is affected by suppression. If you're suppressed, your spread is much higher, which is why it's so difficult to, for example, hit long-range shots as sniper with a sniper rifle when suppressed by, for example, an LMG. Another thing to note is that spread is always worse, your weapon more inaccurate when, for example, hip firing or moving while aiming down sight versus standing still and aiming down sight. But that likely you were already aware of. With that out of the way, then, let's move on to the 4 different spread models that we have in Battlefield 1. The first is the simplest, the scout weaponry, the sniper rifles. Essentially, they don't have any spread. That is to say, if you stand still, aim down sight, fire a shot, there is no spread applied to the bullet. They travel in a perfectly straight line, with, of course, the exception of bullet drop, which is, of course, still a factor, but is not really part of this whole spread mechanic. This isn't, of course, the same if you're moving while shooting or hip firing your sniper rifle. However, there's no spread increase to them. That is to say, there's a certain inaccuracy, a certain spread value that applies to shooting while moving or hip firing with sniper rifles, but this is never any different, independent of how fast you fire the rifle or how long it's been since your last fired shot. With that out of the way, let's move on to the slightly more complex medic rifles, pistols, and shotguns. They essentially have the spread model from Battlefield 4. That is to say, well, if you take the example of the Say Rigotti, you shoot your first shot. This has got a base ADS of 0.21. It's minimum spread. This is where the spread of the weapon starts at. Now, increasingly, progressively, as you fire the weapon, for example, now in the fully automatic mode, per shot you fire, this is going to increase by 0.2 degrees, in the case of the Say Rigotti specifically. Which means your second shot is going to fire at 0.41 degrees of maximum spread, the next shot at 0.61. As soon as you stop firing, your weapon starts to essentially reduce its spread again, which means that if you leave small gaps between actually firing the rifle, you will essentially be able to fire it at its maximum accuracy, minimum spread value, throughout your engagement. In the case of something like the Say Rigotti or the Selbstlauder M1916 Marksman, this means a 1/30th of a second break between individual shots. In the case of the autoloading 8.25, this is a little bit longer at 1/15th of a second between shots. So far, the spread mechanics have been relatively simple. That is to say, essentially identical to what they have been in Battlefield 4. Things change up as we move on to the assault SMGs because they share some properties with the medic rifles, pistols, and shotguns regarding their spread models, but also have some key differences. So much like the medic rifles, they start with a base ADS value. For the example here, we've got the Automatico M1918 Factory, which has a base minimum spread value while aiming down sight of 0.3. As soon as you start firing this weapon, the second shot doesn't actually have its normal spread increase added to it as you had with the Say Rigotti, which was in that case 0.2. In the case of this weapon, it's 0.045. You actually have a first shot multiplier applied to this spread increase for the second bullet coming out, which is of course a little bit confusing given the name that it's the first shot multiplier, which means your second shot when firing the Automatico M1918 Factory is the result of essentially a mathematical equation. Your base ADS value 0.3 plus the first shot multiplier times the spread increase per shot. In the case of the Automatico, that means 0.3 plus 6 times 0.045 because the first shot spread multiplier on the Automatico M1918 factory is 6, leading you to a spread value of 0.57, almost double what your first shot had. From this point onwards, however, the mechanic resorts to a more normal one, which means from this point onwards, each shot you fire increases by the given increase per shot. In the case of the Automatico, this is the 0.045, which leads you then with a spread model for the Automatico factory, our example here specifically, on the first shot of 0.3, the second shot with a large jump at 0.57, and from this point onwards, small increases with 0.615 on the third shot, 0.66 on the fourth, and 0.705 on the fifth. Essentially what this means is that the weapon starts off accuracy, then jumps to inaccuracy, and remains increasingly slightly more inaccurate for the duration of you holding down the trigger. Of course, as soon as you let off the trigger, the spread starts to reset. Last but not least then, we have the support LMGs, the most complex of the spread mechanics that we have in Battlefield 1. They essentially start off the same way the assault SMGs do. You have a base ADS value here, and that in the case of our example today, the BAR 1918 Storm, is 0.24. This then massively increases, just like the assault SMGs on the second shot, because once more here, we have a first shot spread multiplier. However, following this increase on the second shot, spread actually decreases because the values for the first shot spread multiplier and spread increase are actually negative values, which means specifically in the case of the BAR then, you start off with an ADS value, aiming down sight, standing still, of 0.24, our base ADS. Your accuracy or your spread value then jumps relatively highly to 0.665. However, unlike in the case of the assault SMGs, from this point onwards it doesn't continue to increase, but it starts to decrease with values of 0.58 on your third shot, 0.495, 0.41, 0.325, eventually arriving back at 0.24 on your seventh fired shot, which means, much like the SMGs, the LMGs start off accurate, suddenly become very inaccurate. However, unlike the SMGs, they then become increasingly accurate when fired in fully automatic mode. This, of course, means that the LMGs have a very different spread mechanic to the assault SMGs and the medic rifles, and of course the scout weaponry. To give you a couple of examples of how many bullets it usually takes to actually gain your full accuracy again with an LMG, this is very much dependent on the one you pick up. In the case of the BAR, we said it's 7. The Huet comes with a 6-shot return to accuracy, essentially, meaning your 6th shot is once more perfectly accurate or at the minimum available spread number. In the case of the MG15, it's 9, and the Madsen MG, similarly to the BAR, is at 7. With all that being said, there's clearly thought being put behind the different models to clearly differentiate the different weapon categories in Battlefield 1. However, it's not exactly easy to understand, so if I've not explained something fully, you still have some questions, feel free to leave them down below in the comments, of course, with all of your usual video suggestions down there as well. If you found the video interesting, helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. But with all that being said, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 1 video.